Welcome to Stoic Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros.
And I'm Michael Tremblay.
And today we're going to be talking about Stoicism and personal identity. Michael put together some notes to go through this one. It's both, I think, an interesting intellectual topic, but it gets at one of these core questions, who are we? What are we as humans? Which has clear upshot, I think, for guiding one's life, providing a direction really to Stoic philosophy. So I'm excited to go through this.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there, Caleb, where it's one of those things that seems very intuitive, very obvious. Maybe people don't ask that question very often, as in, who am I? Maybe they think, who do I want to be? What kind of life do I want for myself? But they might not ask that even deeper question of, what am I essentially? What is not me? And the Stoics took these questions to be really, really important, really essential to the project of living a good life and self-improvement. And so they're important questions to ask. And we'll talk about what the Stoics thought about personal identity and then the implications that has for living well, for ethics, and for self-improvement. Before we do, I wanted to kick things off with a couple quotes by Epictetus that shows how this question of personal identity can really ground ethical questions and questions of how to live well. So the first is from Handbook 6. So this is Epictetus' Handbook, Chapter 6. He says, "Be not elated at any excellence not your own. If a horse should be elated and say, 'I am handsome,' it might be endurable. But when you are elated and say, 'I have a handsome horse,' know that you are elated only on the merit of the horse. What then is your own? The use of impressions. So that when you're in harmony with nature in this respect, you will be elated with some reason, for a good reason, for you'll be elated at some good of your own." Just to translate that, just to take out the more outdated language, basically he's saying it's a bit weird when people are proud of things outside of themselves. They go, "I have a really nice horse," and today you might say, "Well, I have a really nice car," or you might even point to your kids or something. "Oh, look how impressive my children are, or my family," or if you inherit money, your bank account, or something like this. And he says, that's really weird. It's a really weird thing to do, to point to these things that aren't you and be proud of them. It's a little strange, Epictetus says. Substitute a horse. Some people are still proud of their horses, horse raisers today, but substitute that for whatever you want. Another one where identity comes up, this is Handbook 9. Epictetus says, "Disease is an impediment to the body, but not to the will, unless the will itself chooses. Lameness is an impediment to the leg, but not to the will. Add this reflection on the occasion of everything that happens to you, for you will find that it is an impediment to something else, but not to yourself." And so there's another idea of personal identity, which is when you think you've been harmed or you think something bad has happened to you. Epictetus is pointing out a lot of the times what's happening, the bad thing that's happening, the harmful thing or the disagreeable thing, that's happening to something that isn't actually you. Maybe that's the body. Maybe that's, your leg in this example, or maybe that's your horse from the previous example. But Epictetus is pointing out, look, these things, what's bad for the body is not necessarily bad for you. What's bad for your horse is not necessarily bad for you. And that's another question of one of identity. So wanted to open with those to situate ourselves before we get into the nitty gritty. Any thoughts on those two quotes, Caleb?
Well, they're two good examples, I think, of how identity matters both for positive evaluations of our lives. I'm happy because of this external fact, wealth. Maybe even that case is, I think, is pretty obvious for, especially if you're familiar with Stoicism, but even achievement, because I achieved something external, I'm happy, or I think something good happened to me because of that sense of achievement.
Mm-hmm.
And then the line about, disease is an impediment to the body, but not to the will, I think brings out just how radical Epictetus's view on this, and how both negative evaluation identity matters for negative evaluations as well. In really, I think, a challenging way.
Yeah, that's a great point. I didn't even make that connection, but I think you're dead on about, it's not just it's not just a way to not be sad about bad things. It's also clarifying this idea of personal identity, of what we are essentially, is also a way to stop us from falling victim to this to these positive feelings. And ultimately, the Stoic thinks these positive feelings will come back to bite us, right, and
Hmm.
to harm us down the road. It's not just they're not just sticking their nose up at somebody who's happy about their horse. They're pointing out that that's a way of thinking about the world that will lead to more suffering, lead to more bad than good, because it's an incorrect way of thinking about the world. It is not just they're not just being snooty and being like, well, who cares about your horse? Like, stop bragging. It's it's saying that you've twisted you have a twisted perception of what you should be proud of. You're extending that outside of yourself, and that's not a good way to live.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, great points. So those ideas from Epictetus, they ground us in this discussion of personal identity. And so let's talk about it some more and what that means to the Stoics. So the question of personal identity really matters to Stoicism because Stoicism is about improving ourselves. It's a virtue ethic. And virtue is about achieving excellence. And that's what virtue means. It's what arete in the Greek means. It's about being an excellent thing. And the Greeks thought, and anything could have virtue, right? You could have a virtuous horse, to use the same example. And that would be a horse that is great in the way that horses are great, or great in the way that you should judge a horse. That might be its speed, its agility, maybe its ability to listen to instructions, and so everything has a set of qualities that it's appropriate to evaluate a thing by. If we evaluate a horse by how well it does math or how well it paints, the Stoics would say, well, you're kind of missing the point. You're kind of getting away from the essential nature of the horse. And so likewise, we have an essential nature as humans, and a good life is about maximizing or achieving that nature. It's about achieving human excellence. And so it matters very much in that case what a human is, what a human essentially is, what we essentially are. Because if we think we are, um, if we think we are our body, then a good human life becomes one of the elite athlete, one of one where people that have lameness in the leg have a bad life. People that have disease are necessarily unhappy, regardless of the other parts of their life, because we are our bodies. But if we're not our bodies, then those things matter a lot less, or they matter in a different way in that they matter in terms of how they interact with what we actually are, like our
Hmm.
character or our personality. So that's a bit of the stakes of it before we get into what the Stoics actually thought we were. Um, Anything to add there?
Yeah, well, I like this line you have here in the notes. This why does personal identity matter? This matters because Stoicism is about improving ourselves, so it matters what we are. I think that's an excellent summary. Many worldviews have this account of what we are fundamentally, and that in a way determines what our deepest good is, how we should make decisions. And I think part of Stoicism that is maybe underrated is how much suffering or how many of our mistakes come from misidentifications of what we're identical to. So I think in terms of other worldviews, Buddhism is probably most well known for making that point that so
Mm-hmm.
much suffering is due to a mistaken view about personal identity. But I think that's an equally useful frame for the Stoics, as we'll get into. So that's another way to motivate the importance of this question.
Yeah, you're right. We see it a lot in Buddhism, but it pops up almost everywhere. Or if it doesn't pop up, it's almost taken for granted because
Hmm.
it's that baseline question. And I think you're right that the Buddhists were one of the people to really hammer down how much is at risk if you get this wrong. If other ethical schools take it for granted that, yeah, we're talking about a person, it matters what a person is. the Buddhists were really, really clear that, yeah, well, if you get that wrong, if you slip in that conception, there's a lot at risk. And we'll get to this. The Stoics feel the same way. There's a lot at risk if you get this wrong. So what are we essentially for the Stoics? Where does our identity lie? I'm gonna base this on what Epictetus says, because I think Epictetus makes this the of all the Stoics, he's the most clear about this that I've read, and he makes this the such a fundamental part of his philosophy. I think if we go back into the earlier Stoics, you're probably going to get an answer that is similar, which is that every Stoic is going to say that we are our minds, we are our character. More technically, the ancient Stoics before Epictetus are going to say that we're our hegemonikon, which is the ruling center, which is the that's what hegemonikon means. It means just the part of our minds or brains that experiences sensations and reflects and assents and experiences impulses to act and things like this. So you think of this as, um, the hegemonikon had these other things, like it had the capacity to reproduce, the capacity, I think, to form language. So it had these other functions. But we really think of it as that essential part of our minds. So the Stoics are gonna be consistent right up from the founding of Stoicism, that we are that ruling part of our minds, that part of our minds that reflects, that thinks, that makes decisions. They call that the hegemonikon. And then Epictetus is actually going to shrink this even further to what he calls the prohairesis. Some people might have heard this before, some not. It's a Greek technical term. It means something like the faculty of choice, the will to choose. It sometimes gets translated as. The Greek means that which selects, that which reaches out and chooses. And so for Epictetus, this is it's a subsection of our mind. It's a subsection of our hegemonikon. So he actually restricts our identity to something really specific and even smaller than the previous Stoics. And so if the hegemonikon was maybe this more robust part of our minds, like all the things we experience, all the things we think and do, Epictetus is going to shrink that to just the choosing part of ourselves. And he does this because there's a difference between our prohairesis and the rest of our mind, because there's plenty parts of our mental life that are not within our faculty of choice. They're not things that are up to us. And the prohairesis is going to be just those things that are up to us. And so an example of something not up to us, if you think of when you experience pain, chronic pain, or you hear a loud noise, these are things that infiltrate our mind. These are really strong impressions that infiltrate our mind. They enter the hegemonikon, but they don't enter the prohairesis, that smaller part. Those are things that are not up to us, that are parts of our mind. And Epictetus is going to shrink says that our identity is actually that small part that is just up to us.
Mm-hmm.
And so what is the actual prohairesis? What is the subset of our minds that is up to us, that doesn't involve anything outside of ourselves, that we can put our personal identity in? Well, for Epictetus, it's three things. We talked about this in our episode on Stoic psychology. It's our reflection on impressions, our assent to impressions, so when we turn those impressions into beliefs, and then the impulses or emotions we feel from those beliefs. So the impulses to act, the desires that we feel when we assent to impressions, when we form beliefs. This is a good thing, I should do this. This is a bad thing, I shouldn't do this, or I should be angry about this. Then the anger is that impulse, is that feeling. So the psychological consequences of our beliefs. So we can think of our identity in Epictetus's terms, then it is this really small box in our minds. The box receives impressions, but we are not the impressions. It hears the sound, it sees something, and then we are the thing that then receives the impression and then does something with it. We either admit ignorance and we don't let the impression in the box. We say, I don't know if that's true or not. The example I always use to back up a bit is that impression of somebody bumps into you and you think, oh, maybe that person's a jerk. That is not ourself. Ourself is that impression comes up against ourselves, which is this choosing faculty. And then we either admit ignorance. We say, look, I don't know how to judge this. I don't know how to judge this impression. I don't have enough information. We don't let it into the box, or we
Hmm.
accept the impression as true. We say, yeah, that person is a jerk. We let it into the box, which is ourselves, and then it changes us. We become angry. We have a new belief, or we reject the impression. We say, no, it's false. That person's a, that person's actually a nice person. They made a mistake, or they were just joking around. It was my friend bumping into me on purpose. And then we've still let it into the box ourselves, and it's changed us. Just we formed a opposite belief. We formed a belief that it's false. So that was a lot, but just to reiterate that one more time, what are we? Earlier Stoics say we are our hegemonicon, which is something like our minds, the commanding faculty, the part of us that thinks and feels and perceives. And Epictetus rightly points out, well, if we're that, then our minds aren't up to us, because that hegemonicon's not up to us, because there's plenty of things that enter our mind that we don't have control over, that we don't determine. Like if somebody bumps into me, I feel that enters my mind. So what I really am is actually something even smaller. I'm that part of my mind that reflects on the impressions we receive. I'm that part of my mind that decides to either accept these impressions as true or reject them as false. And then I'm the part of my mind that experiences the consequences of these new beliefs once I've formed them. So Epictetus shrinks our identity to that really small part of ourselves. Anything to clarify there?
I don't think I have anything to clarify there, but I think it's interesting to connect this to the popular phrase "You are not your thoughts,"
Hmm.
which I think connects really nicely to this point that you're not an impression. Someone bumps into you, some immediate physical sensations pop up, some perhaps immediate ideas about whether you've been wronged or that you're annoyed, and so on occur. But those aren't, that's not you. And you can apply that to more serious situations too, when you react in a specific way or feel sensations of pain, pleasure, and such. I think at the same time, to sort of dive into this idea of thought, I suppose, and add some complication there. I think the Stoics would say, if you have a kind of way of thinking or a disposition to think in a certain way, a way of responding to these impressions, that is you. So,
Mm-hmm.
in a certain sense, you might be that part that always responds with, say, curiosity if you're whenever you're bumped, or responds with immediate anger that you've been wronged. Those patterns, that's those patterns of responses, of judgments, that's what you are. So in that sense, this English word thought has some, is a bit vague and hides some complexity. I think the Stoic idea of personal identity teases out nicely.
Yeah, I think that's so insightful, right? You're not your thoughts, but you are how you think. And there's some ambiguity there or vagueness, but that's the Stoic view. You're not your thoughts, but you are how you think, which is to say you are the habits, tendencies, patterns, and ways that you reflect on your thoughts. That is the part that's up to you. That's the part that you're responsible for, because it is you. So I think you gave the great example of the person who, curious person. That, well, what do we say when we say a curious person? Well, that's the way that they tend to respond to impressions. If they receive an impression of something new, they go, "Oh, what is that? I want to know more about that." The skeptical person, the angry person. What is the angry person but a way of tending to respond to impressions? So when you encounter other people, you tend to blame them. You tend to want to get back at them. Um, that is you, right? That is and that's the classic Stoic example, which is to say two different people receive the same impression. They respond in totally different ways, and that tells you about the person. It doesn't tell you about the impression, right?
Mhm.
If two people get bumped into, one person brushes it off, and one person gets angry. Well, you you haven't learned that was a impression that must deserve anger. You've learned about the kind of person. One person is a more laid back, and one person's more high strung. And those are the things that we can judge. And well, we're judging because those are the things that we should judge when we talk about you, because that's what you are. And so that gets to my next point. I think that's a really good way of putting it. Is you're not those thoughts, but you are your thinking patterns. And so Epictetus's point is that we are always, or one of his points is that we are always existing, which is to say, we are always encountering impressions and then we're always responding to them. As Epictetus talks about, the point of philosophy is making the right use of impressions. And this is big. Another way of saying this is to say, to be a good, happy person, you have to be excellent, and excellence for people as things that respond to impressions is responding to impressions well. Um, and so we've talked about responding in an angry way. Um, but really what Epictetus would say is the goal here and what a good person looks like is one who is skeptical or admits ignorance when they don't know better. So someone who is cautious about forming false beliefs, is careful not to fall into false narratives, not to be tricked. It's someone who has a good standard of judgment to identify which impressions are true. So you're not skeptical all the time, but you have a way to say, well, what is actually the truth of the matter here and how can I get to the bottom of it? And then you're willing to accept the things that are true and you're willing to reject the things that are false using that good standard of judgment. So that's what I think in the simplest terms possible, that's what a good prohyracist looks like. It's one that it's one that admits ignorance when it doesn't know, and it's one that uses a good standard of judgment to figure out what's true and what's false. And if that's what a good prohyracist looks like, the next step in Epictetus' argument is to say, well, that's what a good person is, right? Because you are your prohyracist. You are that part of you that thinks and chooses. And so when you're proud of yourself, you want to be proud of yourself when you make good judgments, when you suspend judgment when you don't know, and you apply a good standard of judgment for what's true or what's false. And when you're ashamed of yourself or embarrassed about yourself, this should apply the same way as well. It should apply to this capacity to think well and reflect well. And so when we're judging people, we should be judging them on this, not the quality of their horse and not the if they have a disabled leg. It's about, well, how well do they, how nice is their prohyracist? How well do they reflect and think and come about truth? When you say you're not your thoughts, you're your way, that second part, you are the way you think about them. We judge ourselves based on how we think about them, how we reflect. And as you said, are you a curious person? Are you a kind person? And that's where the virtues come in. So when we think about virtues, um, they're not these innate things developed. And so when we think about the virtues, I think there's something to connect there when you made that claim about, oh, are you a curious person? Or are you an angry person? When we think about the virtues, they're not these um, irrational dispositions. Wow, he's a courageous person. He always rushes into battle. When we call someone courageous, disciplined, just, it's the same way you might call someone curious or angry. We say it's a tendency, it's a way you tend to relate to your impressions. A
Mm-hmm.
courageous person tends to do a good job at identifying what's worth being afraid of and what's not worth being afraid of. A just person tends to do a good job when they receive these kinds of impressions of correctly identifying when they owe somebody something, when they don't, and what people deserve in certain situations. And so you think of these virtues as um, really ways of acting, but the fundamental action we take is that initial judgment, that use of a prohyracist. Um, and that's a real paradigm shift. If you are used to quantifying humans at the level of results, at the level of either what they go about achieving out in the world or external appearances or results, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think this is really well put. And I love how it's in a way, such a simple idea that unlocks a lot of Stoic value theory, and of course, can also be applied practically to thinking through how to manage emotions, to making decisions about what one ought to do. and even to maybe more theoretical matters. Like I think it took me a while, when I first came across Stoicism. Initially, it took me a while to understand the idea of indifference. A pretty natural understanding of indifference is just something that you never sacrifice for the sake of virtue. And I think that's a good first pass. But another way to put it is, indifference are just the material of virtue. They're what you're selecting. And of course, prohyresis, that's us. That's that faculty of selection, of choice. And so, a difference, these are just these things that stand outside of us, that are the material of life. And I think that gives you the same result, that of course you never sacrifice indifference for the sake of virtue, but provides more grounding to why that's so, which is just that, indifference, those are the things we choose, we select between, not the things that, make a life a good one or a bad one. That depends on us, what we are, according to the Stoic picture, which is the thing that chooses indifference. So perhaps that's a bit abstract, but I thought that was really nice, and something that maybe a way to unlock, at least for me, was a way to unlock this idea of indifference more deeply than the initial explanation that's commonly given.
I'll try to use an example to make it less abstract, which is we all I could take a non-stoic, I could take anybody off the street and say like, look, imagine somebody 500 years before, someone who lived 500 years before you, their name was Greg, and it's like, okay, I'm imagining them. Okay, now imagine Greg was poor, and you're like, okay, and it's like, has your life gotten worse? And the person will say, no, like, I feel bad for Greg, but what does that have to do with me? And you'd be like, exactly, it has nothing to do with you, right? And this is the same way the Stoics would think about indifference. It's really radical. It's really hard to wrap your head around, but it's the view of to say, okay, well, if I'm born poor or I'm born rich, what does that have to do with me? There's nothing to do with me, right? As Epictetus would say, it is nothing to me, and that's what he means by that. It says it has nothing to do with my identity. Now, if I go and I use, if my poverty causes me to lie and cheat and steal, or I turn to that life because of that poverty, now that's a bad thing. But the bad thing is the actions that I've taken. If my wealth has caused me to become, callous to other people, or not very just, and kind of disrespectful to others, well, now that's a bad thing. But
Mm-hmm.
on its own, it's nothing to me. And I think we all get that first example. If I told you, as another Epictetus example, if I told you the number of stars in the sky was even instead of odd, you'd be like, I do not care, right? What is this? This does not matter to me. And that's the way the sage feels about, you have a beautiful horse or you have an ugly horse, right? Goes, okay, like, what does that have to do with what we're talking about? And that's that real. I think it's really hard to get there, but that's the real idea of indifference, right? It's like that. Now, I might be taking that a bit too far, because we have that notion of things being preferred. That might be a bit like a true
Sure, sure,
indifferent.
yeah.
Some things are preferred and some things aren't, but it's still it's still this idea of, I think, even if you get to that idea of it's nothing to me first, then you can start working in the preference later.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and that's for me why that idea of identity is so helpful with indifference, as you were saying.
Yeah, I think so. Well, I suppose just to expand on that a little bit, preference, dispreferred, that just helps you. I suppose that's just a way to help you select between indifference,
Yeah.
health, pleasure, pain, good reputation, uh, both for yourself and for others, is a general reason to prefer. Those are preferable, and maybe if there's a decision that can be expected to result in one of those preferable indifference for yourself or for others, that's a reason to do it. And in that sense, and it's something that just needs to be weighed against every other consideration. So I
Mhm.
suppose that's where the preferred or dispreferred comes into play, is in helping us decide how to make these decisions. Why do Stoics have this idea of preferred and dispreferred indifference to begin with? It's kind of odd. Maybe it seems like a way to sneak in some kind of value theory, but I think it makes sense because you need a way to determine how to make choices. Otherwise, every decision becomes like, the number of stars, odd or even.
Hmm.
Um, so that's I think that's another another important theoretical thought, I suppose, on why you need preferred and dispreferred indifference, and then how that comes in to play for thinking what we are. These are the things that are natural for us, but that just guides decisions. It doesn't determine them.
Yeah, it guides decisions, but you can be a great person um, with a diseased body. And by the Stoic, right, that's the Stoic argument is that, well, you're a great person. You should be judged as a great person. You should be judged to have had a great life. If you were making the right decisions, um, you have a great prohairesis, great virtue, character, regardless of what happens to your body or what happens to your horse. Um, but in a normal situation, we want to kind of we use those indifferents to select and to navigate the world. Um, and so to connect this back, I think if there's one idea about personal identity, it's going to be this one, and you'll get this reading Epictetus, and it's such a paradigm shift as you were mentioning. I think it's that this is the prohairesis is our fundamental action. It's our fundamental way of being, which is to say, if a runner runs, a builder builds, a human forms belief, a human thinks. They practice reflection and assent to impressions. That's the thing that we do. That's the thing that we should be judged by. Another thing, another consequence of this, I don't see this as much, but I know some people run into this when they first learn about the dichotomy of control. So it's worth touching on. Another consequence of this is it's another reason why the dichotomy of control is sometimes confusing language, because when you first hear it, you might think, well, I control my mind. Oh, I don't control, what other people think of me, but I control my mind. And we want to be careful here not to put the I outside of ourselves, which is to say, we don't want to think we are something, we are something that sits outside of that mind and then controls it. It looks down at the way we're thinking and then pulls the strings,
Mm-hmm.
because we are the thing that thinks, right? We are the mind doing the thinking. And so we can, through mindfulness and intentional reflection and study, is we can change those patterns. We can change that trajectory. We can, on a moment by moment basis, with an incredible focus, almost allow no false impression to come through. But when you think, oh, that's a courageous person, a just person, an angry person, you can't just step outside yourself and say, I've chosen no longer to be an angry person, because you are those built up patterns of thinking and reflecting and those built up beliefs that have made you angry. And so the study of Stoicism is kind of unwinding those patterns, unwinding those habits, turning yourself into a better thinking thing over time. And so that's why we talked about this a bit in the dichotomy of control episodes. That's why you're responsible for how you think, but you don't control how you think in terms of, you can't on a moment by moment rewire the system entirely, right? You're only ever working with the material you have, and the material you have is yourself. That's a bit abstract, but just saying this point that you don't stand. It's not like you're holding a controller and you stand outside yourself and you choose how you think. You're only ever bringing yourself to those moments where you're getting angry or being cowardly or courageous. You're only ever bringing yourself to them at your current level of progress, with your current level of your current degree of Stoic beliefs or lack of Stoic beliefs. And so you're only ever working with that material, and you can
Mm-hmm.
modulate your success with mindfulness and intense focus, but you can't rewrite yourself. You can't stop being yourself, which I think something you agree with, Caleb, but I think it's something that people,
Yeah, yeah,
um,
absolutely.
it's easy to misunderstand sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's always good to clear up, and uh, yeah, I think that's helpful for to understand.
Oh, and I was going to finish. So, if that's the view of identity, we are our prohairesis. I'm going to talk on some consequences. We are choosing faculty. We are the thing that thinks, right? Some consequences of that in terms of how we live and how we think about these questions ethically. So, I have three of these, and Caleb, feel free to add any others that come up to you. First is that the first consequence of this is that we're not the things we own or what people think of us. We're not even our bodies. We're not things external to us, which is everything outside of our minds. And so we shouldn't be afraid when people threaten those things. People shouldn't be able to control how we think and how we act by threatening the things outside of ourselves, because that is not us. So there's no real harm or threat to us at that fundamental level. And so a famous Epictetus quote from Discourses 1.1, he's asked to betray a secret. And Epictetus says, "I will not betray it, for this is in my power. Then I will chain you up," they threaten. "What do you say, man? Chain me up? You'll chain my leg, but not Zeus himself can get the better of my faculty of choice." And that's what Prohyrus is there. And
Hmm.
so Epictetus pointed out, man, you're threatening. You can't actually threaten me. Not even Zeus could threaten me. You can chain me up. You can destroy my house. You can, you can threaten my beautiful horse, but not even God can control that freedom I have to think and reflect. That is something other people can't threaten.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Um, yeah, so that's just that. It's just important to remind ourselves when we get stressed or worried. Say, hey, I'm not actually at risk here, and so I shouldn't. I shouldn't feel like I'm threatened, and I should remember that I'm not threatened. It's just things that I have are threatened, maybe. And so another consequence, a second consequence of this theory of identity, is that we need to build a life focused on improving ourselves. And too often we attach value to improving something that is literally not us. We are literally, like in the term, in the sense of self-improvement, not engaged in self-improvement when we improve things outside of ourselves. We are engaged in external improvement. And that comes back to the quote from the beginning of the episode. I'll read it again. Be not elated at any excellence that is not your own. If a horse should be elated and say, "I am handsome," it might be endurable. But when you're elated and say, "I have a handsome horse," know that you're elated only on the merit of the horse. What then is your own? The use of impressions. So that when you're in harmony with nature in this respect, you will be elated for some reason, for a good reason, he means. For you'll be elated at some good of your own. And that's just that point of how often, I think of people today. Let's say if you take something like fitness and people decide to focus on improving their bodies. I think there's something really valuable in improving your body and developing fitness and getting into weightlifting or dieting or something like that. But the Stoic would say the things that are valuable about that are the things that are your own, which is to say the discipline you develop, the ability to avoid temptation, the ability to be consistent, to stick to plans that you've set for yourself. These are things you can say about yourself. And these are the things you should be proud of. But when people start putting the pride actually in the external, they put it in their bodies, for example, that they're making a mistake. They're no longer engaged in self-improvement.
Hmm.
It's them pointing out their horse. And the horse is something you could buy immediately. So even the body example is a bit more extreme, but it's not you, right? You are the discipline and the choices, and that's the thing you should be proud of. And so that's not something we do in today's society. If you think of the bodybuilder, we don't reward the bodybuilder who had the most discipline. We reward the one who has the best objective body. And there's something just stoic there about recognizing that, look, the world is not going to necessarily recognize self improvement. They'll recognize external development, but I need to be after self improvement. And that's a key lesson.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder if that's some of the intuition people have behind things like performance enhancing drugs or something like this. That those are less evidence about someone's character. Maybe there's, I wouldn't want to make too much out of that, but I think there's something to that um, line of thought.
Yeah, and I don't know. I think absolutely is that we kind of mix these things together
Hmm.
in sport. We want it to be a meritocracy, but then we also just admire talent, and those two kinds of things get mixed together. Where the Stoics are the pure meritocracy. They go, well, I don't care if you finished 100th or you finished, last, right? Maybe you have some sort of disability or physical impediment that makes you actually unable to compete at a high level. If you showed the discipline, the character development, um, then that's the real win. It is in a way the participation trophy trope, as the participation trophy rewards what's up to them, right? Which is like, you registered, you did it, you get a trophy for that because you showed the thing, and you showed something admirable that is up to you, that is a part of you. And so I think there's something to that, in that I think is, because often stoicism can get this rap for being kind of hardcore, but I think there's something kind of sweet and I guess just egalitarian about that.
Yeah, I think it's. I think one reason the Stoic teachers advise us not to judge others is that the most obvious way to judge people is the results of their actions,
Yeah,
their
totally.
achievements, mistakes, and so on. But we don't have as good access to people's character, how they think. So we should always be careful of our judgments about others, especially when we're considering questions. Are they a good person, a bad person, and so on. Ultimately, those sorts of things are really difficult to get at on the Stoic picture, because what it is to be a good person or a bad person is not immediately obvious from their someone's actions. It's almost maybe an analogy that doesn't quite work. Maybe it works, as you have the first, second, third place type trophies. You've got participation trophies. Stoics, they're almost you know in between. Like, we want excellent participation. You participated, and you did it to the best of your ability. And how do you assess that? That's difficult. So I think that's why Stoics put a question mark around a lot of positive and negative evaluations about people.
Well, I think that's great. Yeah, because that's the criticism against participation trophy, is that you didn't do anything, you didn't work hard, you didn't earn it. Um, and so I think you're right, which is to say that that's what the Stoics want, is they want excellent participation. I never thought of it that way. That's the middle ground. Right? They want you to do the things that are up to you the best you can. And then once you've done that, that's a first place in the Stoic medal system,
Yeah.
which might put you pretty low if you tend to be actually quite bad at the thing. Especially sports where you can actually just like hit a physical limit, right? You can
Mhm.
actually just not be genetically able to do something. And so that's the second lesson. First lesson is that, look, people can't really threaten us because they can't really touch us. And that there's something empowering about that. Second is that when you want to focus on self improvement, you got to improve yourself. And often we make these proxies for self improvement, and we forget what we are. The third lesson, well, I think it connects back to that first one. Um, it's that idea of, we really, really can't be harmed by others. Um, and not only not harmed, but we lose then, because I guess the next stage is that because we can't be harmed, we actually lose these ideas of resentment or anger, or that we have, because those are rely on this idea that we've been harmed. Epictetus has this other quote about how, um, the beginner blames other people, the intermediate blames themselves, and the advanced person blames nobody. And there's something to that about the beginners blaming other people because they think, oh, it didn't go this way because of this person. I was harmed because of what that person did. And the progressing Stoic recognizes that, look, these other people aren't actually as involved in my success or failure as I thought them to be. They're actually not as big of a deal in terms of my self improvement. And I'll connect this back to Epictetus's handbook, just chapter one, the very start. But people often glance over this part when they talk about the dichotomy of control. Epictetus says, if you take for your own only that which is your own, and view what belongs to others just as it really is, then no one will ever compel you, no one will restrict you, you'll find no fault with anyone, you'll accuse no one, you'll do nothing against your will. No one will hurt you. You will not have an enemy, nor will you suffer any harm. And so that's that idea of just taking that step further of, not only can people not threaten you or control you, but you actually, when you adopt this perspective on identity, gain some permission to let go a lot of the anger, resentment, or fear that you've been carrying. Because if you can make this identity division right, if you can take for your own only that which is your own, and view what belongs to others as what belongs to others, then you really will not be harmed. You will accuse no one. You'll find fault with no one. And that's a pretty empowering ethical ideal that you get to just by clarifying and really focusing in on what you are and what you're not, and eliminating all the false beliefs and unhealthy emotions that come from getting that distinction wrong.
Absolutely.
Great. Anything else, Caleb, on identity?
I don't think so. Do you have anything else to add?
No, I just think that I think that's a great place to end. As you were saying, that understand that people, don't be threatened by people that threaten things that aren't you. Don't take pride in things that aren't you. And then when you really focus in and really realize that what you are is just yourself, your mind, your capacity to make choices, then a lot of those angers, accusations, resentments, fears, they dissipate. And that's it's a pretty cool place to get with just a couple of clarifications. And that's why I think the Stoic theory of identity is so important to their ethical project and to our self-improvement.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I suppose open up the episode with this thought that this question matters because it provides a direction to life, a way of guiding decisions. It helps with our decision making because it's essential in order to improve oneself to know what you are. And for the Stoics, that's a thinking thing. So what matters is thinking well, responding to your impressions well. And I suppose that's the project.
That's right. As we said at the start, yeah, Stoicism is about improving ourselves. So really take the time to understand what you are. Otherwise, you can't really engage in that project.
Yeah, yeah, and it's something one always needs to remind oneself of, because so many habits we've already established, so many parts of the outside world are telling you that you're something else, you're something bigger, and those sorts of messages are, whether they come from yourself or from others, are mistaken on the Stoic view, and they're going to lead to less than ideal decisions and a less than ideal life.
Yeah, great. Good point.
Cool.
Let's end it there. Thanks, Caleb.
All right. Thanks, Michael. Thanks for listening to Stoic Conversations. Please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share it with a friend. If you want to dive deeper still, search Stoa in the App Store or Play Store for a complete app with routines, meditations, and lessons designed to help people become more stoic. And I'd also like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. You can find more of his work at ancientlyre.com. And finally, please get in touch with us. Send a message to stoa@stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback, questions, or recommendations. Until next time.